Thanks so much, and it's absolutely great to be here and to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Michael Wood at our first ever joint event between SACU and HSBC China Connect. As John said, SACU was founded in 1965, in fact, by Joseph Needham and a number of other people, and it had the aim of building understanding by educating the British public about all things to do with China and the Chinese. In those early days, difficult to imagine, it was one of the only ways to get to China. And so people had to join SACU and then go on organized official tours. There were thousands of members at that stage, and people like, for example, David Attenborough had their first taste of China through SACU. As John says, that was 55 years ago, and SACU, the world is very different now. And SACU is a much more smaller, focused organization, but still with the mission of promoting friendship and understanding between the peoples of China and UK. And after our last president passed away, SACU spent many years without a president, trying to consider who could best help it in this new era. Obviously conscious of the importance of film and media and that virtual world in terms of influencing British public's thinking, and mindful of Michael's outstanding work and his empathy for the Chinese people, we kind of dared to approach him and were absolutely delighted when he accepted that he would become our president. So Michael is, as John said, a renowned historian, broadcaster and filmmaker with over 4 decades in which he's brought history alive for viewers and readers in Britain and in fact across the whole world. He's also the Professor of Public History at the University of Manchester, and as people will know, Manchester has a very strong Chinese links and the largest Chinese student body in Europe. Michael is the author of several highly praised books, which are big bestsellers, and he doesn't just focus on China. He's written and published on English history and has made 120 documentary films which have been seen all over the world. Amongst them, The Story of India was described by the Wall Street Journal as the gold standard of documentary history making. People will remember, I'm sure, The Story of China, which was filmed, shown through BBC Two, and the state news agency in China, Xinhua, said it had transcended the barriers of ethnicity and belief and brought something inexplicably powerful and touching to the TV audience. And his book, The Story of India, is now out in Mandarin and Cantonese, and his acclaimed biography of Shakespeare, so he does Shakespeare as well, is also published in China. His latest film was Du Fu, and that was shown on CCTV and BBC. And Du Fu was China's greatest poet. But we're here today to hear about his book, The Story of China. I will now show my visual aid, The Story of China, which was published in September. And I'm really excited and delighted to introduce Michael Wood to you. So Michael, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Zoe, and thanks, John. It's really great to be with you to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and I'm sure yours too, China. Thank you for inviting me. HSBC, I need hardly say to tonight's audience, has played quite a role in the story of modern China over the last more than 150 years, a role symbolized of course, in that famous building on the Shanghai Bund, which will be celebrating its 100th, I think, in 2 or 3 years. With those murals showing the great cities of the world, with inscriptions on them speaking of the coming brotherhood of mankind, beckoning us towards the global future. And of course, even then, in 1923, people were already talking about Shanghai as the city of the future that would in time overtake everywhere else on the planet. How prophetic was that? But it's very nice with an HSBC audience to remember that actually British financial and commercial acumen played a real part in the rise of China, especially in that often forgotten period between 1900 and 1949. As you've heard, I'm a filmmaker. I first went to China in the early 80s and started making films end of the 80s, made a dozen films in the last few years. And in making these films, I've always been very keen that the audience, the TV audience, should enjoy the experience of being in China. and should enjoy being with the Chinese people, which I've always found a fantastic experience. And I've also been keen to show that Chinese history shouldn't be inaccessible and difficult. It's fantastically dramatic, of course, but creative and human. These are wonderful stories with larger than life characters to set behind any of those that you find in Western history. Not only emperors, but scientists and poets, travelers, men and women. People whose stories, if you tell them right, tell you something about the enduring values of Chinese civilization. That's what I'd like to talk about tonight. That's what I've tried to put in the book, if you like. And I've written it, I should say, I think with a filmmaker's eye. In a nutshell, it's one that mixes grand narrative with the close-up, the intimate close-up, the court and the country, the rulers and the people, sometimes looking from the bottom up, not the top down. The book makes many visits to villages and localities, especially in the last 1,000 years. Want to give a sense of the landscape and the cultures of China as well. I think anybody who's known China even since the beginning of the 80s, you will know that I think many people then thought that the traditional culture of China had been lost in the previous 30 years. But of course it hasn't been. There's a scene very early in the book at a place off the beaten track, 200 miles into the countryside south of Zhengzhou in the Henan Plain, where 1 million ordinary people are gathering for a festival at the shrine of the goddess Niu Hua, part of this incredible upsurge of traditional culture which is happening in China today. So those are the kind of key elements in the book, if you like, the grand narrative, the culture of the people as well as the rulers, a lot of women's stories, and I've tried to make it as up to date as possible. There's even an epilogue on COVID-19, but it uses some of the remarkable discoveries that have been made in the last decade or two that have only just been published in the last 3 or 4 years. Staggering archaeological finds of just in print. To give you one example, which I can't resist, soldiers' letters from the Qin dynasty, the real life terracotta army speaking in their own voices, a bit like the Vindolanda tablets from Hadrian's Wall, but much more vivid. And if I can say, I mean, just listen to this. Dear Mum, our unit is about to attack rebel strongholds in Henan. How long it will take, how many of us will be captured or wounded, no one knows. The soldier doesn't say, we might be killed, of course, writing to his mother. And then there's a postscript. But when you get this letter, Mum, could you look in Anlu Market and get some cheap silk cloth? And if you've got time, run me up an unlined kilt and shirt and send them with the cash that I've asked for. If the cloth's too dear, just send the cash and I'll run up the clothes myself. And then, how's Auntie? How's Sister? Aunt Gushu? Is the marriage still on? It's magical, isn't it? This stuff has just very recently come up in print. That's the magic of history. It is above all the voices. And I say the voices, after all, don't you think that if we're interested in the past, we study the past, the people of the past, the thing we most of all want to hear is the voices of the people of the past. In what way were they like us? In what way were they different? How did they respond to the often tumultuous events of their own times? How did they feel? Of course, that's a very hard thing to do, even in our own ancient and medieval culture, an English medieval village, for example. But China, as the great sinologist Simon Leys said so memorably, is the other pole of the human mind. It's only when we study China, said Leys, that we can truly understand what are universal human values and what we think are, but are merely only Western idiosyncrasy. So that question of how we see each other is something that I've try to approach in the book quite a few times. So in the book, you'll hear China's voices for over 3,000 years, wonderful richness and diversity of sources. And tonight I've just chosen 5 of my favorites, which I hope you will agree speak directly to us today, not only revealing the personality of the people who spoke those words or wrote those words, but also reveal to us certain key things about the values of the civilization which are still there. So I've chosen 5 writers, and the first is a poet. Poetry is fundamental and important aspect of Chinese culture, and it has been for 3,000 years. It's often forgotten. China is the oldest continuous living tradition of poetry in the world. The Book of Songs, which is an anthology of, wonderful anthology of war, love, work, festivals and celebrations, goes back to the 11th century BC. Poets, mainly men, but some women. It's older than the Odyssey or the Iliad. So poets have been the great voices of Chinese civilization all the way through. There are many great ages of Chinese poetry, but by common consent, the Tang dynasty, which goes from the early 7th century to around 900, is the greatest. I once did a vox pops in the Shanghai Expo, just going around the crowds of visitors, asking them, what's your favorite period of Chinese history? And a few said the Song, my particular favorite, I should say, but most said the Tang. Most said the Tang. China went out to the world, and China had such a great culture and such great poetry. That's what people kept saying. More than 40,000 poems survive from the Tang dynasty, men and women. And I think by common consent, although some would say Li Bai, most Chinese people feel the greatest poet is Du Fu, who lived from 712 to 770. As you heard Zoe mention, we made a film about him recently, just before COVID hit in the autumn of last year. We shot it with readings by Sir Ian McKellen of the poetry. And he's often called the Chinese Shakespeare. In fact, Professor Stephen Owen in our film, a great Harvard sinologist, said there's Dante, there's Shakespeare, and there's Du Fu. These are the poets that helped establish the emotional vocabulary of the culture. And in his opinion, Du Fu wrote the greatest words in the Chinese language. And recently, we've really been able to understand that. Amazingly, the first complete edition in Chinese of Du Fu's poetry only came out in 2014, at the end of a 30-year project. Stephen Owen's complete version in English came out in 2016, and a wonderful edition by Nicolas Chapuis, the EU ambassador in Beijing, is appearing in French with a fabulous commentary. So for the first time, I think foreigners can understand the extraordinary range of this very great poet. A protean talent, really. Shakespeare's the only comparison. He wrote about friendship and life and the intimate details of domestic life, children, friendship, but above all, he's the poet historian, and he wrote about war and lived through the cataclysm of the fall of the Tang in the mid-8th century, in which 30 million people, according to the Tang censuses, were displaced or died of famine and war. And that turned him into a refugee. So he experienced what we see on our TV screens in the Yemen and Syria himself. And he made his art about that, transforms his art in the middle of his life. He wrote about the ordinary people. I remember being in the lovely tourist site in Chengdu of the site of Du Fu's thatched cottage, and an old man, local old man, who told me he came at least twice a month and just to meditate on Du Fu and his poetry. And he loved him because he spoke for the ordinary people. He spoke for the people. You'll, as perhaps a British reader would find echoes of Kipling's ventriloquy of the ordinary soldier, you know, Danny Deever or Tommy Atkins, The Road to Mandalay, or maybe the First World War poets, and that sense, terrible, tragic sense that a civilization and its values were being destroyed, and that an old world was ending and the new world was going to be born. Du Fu experienced all that. And a tiny little bit of reading for him here. When he writes these themes, to me, he becomes universal. He goes home in the middle of the war. His family are out in a village for safety beyond Xi'an, and discovers that his baby son has died of starvation. "I'm ashamed of being a father," he wrote, "so poor that I caused my son to starve to death. How could I know that the autumn harvest was not enough to save the poor from disaster? And I'm one of the privileged. If my life is so bitter, then how much worse is the life of the common man?" You'd look at maybe Shakespeare's King Lear for a parallel to that great poem. He discovered what it was like to be a poor, naked, unaccommodated man, as Shakespeare says. And what does Du Fu's poetry tell us about China? I mean, it's taught in every school in China. Every child learns a couple of the great poems of Du Fu. Everybody carries him with them. Well, above all, I think you'd say he was a Confucian. His cultural roots were those values which are so integral to Chinese civilization: benevolence, virtue, truthfulness, morality, civility. These ideas have been internalized by the culture for centuries before Du Fu, and have been really ever since, and among educated people still are. And so filtered through the education of the elites, he becomes a moral conscience for the nation, and his words still express something of what it means to be Chinese. I'd add the last thought to that, although I'm already in danger of overrunning, I think. China's not a religious society in our terms. You know, of course, you've got Taoism and Buddhism and folk religions everywhere, and they're all enjoying massive resurgence today. But there wasn't an all-embracing moral system that came from a theological authority, from a religion, if you like, as there is in Western monotheism. They got that from Confucianism. Proof, if proof were needed, that you don't need a theological system with a supreme God to have a moral order in society. Recently, Tom Holland, in his brilliant book, Dominion, argued that we in the West still think like Christians. Well, the Chinese still think like Confucians. And in poetry, which is so close to the Chinese heart, Du Fu's the person who channels that. My second voice is a historian. I couldn't miss out the historian. And of course, history has been a massively important fact in Chinese culture. There's a continuous tradition of historical narrative over 2,500 years. Earliest great narrative coming from the 11th century BC. History had a unique status because, of course, it formed the official narrative, and hence was rewritten by every dynasty. It underwrote the narrative of the state. But the belief among the great historians was that you must tell the truth of that narrative and express moral judgments on good and bad rule. Hence, the tyrannical first emperor, Qin Huangdi, buried the historians alive and burned the history books, fearing the power of the past to discredit the present. The fear of tyrants throughout history. So my second voice lived in the Han Dynasty. He's a historian around 100 BC, century or so after the book burning. His name is Sima Qian. And his father was what we would call a historian, a keeper of the imperial calendar. And his father had planned a narrative of the lost history of China, the history before the book burnings. But he never finished it. And on his deathbed, he made his son swear that he would. But Sima Qian fell foul of the emperor Wu Di and spoke up for a man he believed had been wrongly condemned. And the furious emperor then condemned him. He was expected to commit suicide, but the only way out was to accept castration and humiliation. And then you could stay alive. And of course, any gentleman would have killed himself, but Sima Qian had spoken, had promised sworn to his father that he would complete the history and accepted the punishment. And he tells the story in what's perhaps the most famous letter in Chinese literature. I'll just read you a tiny bit of it in his voice. I've given myself up to my useless writings. I've brought together the old traditions which were scattered and lost, examined the deeds and events of the past, and investigated the principles behind their success and failure, their rise and fall. But before I'd finished my draft, I met with this calamity. And it's because it had not been finished that I submitted to the extreme penalty. When I've completed the work, if it can be handed down so that people can appreciate it and it can be read in the great cities and in the villages, then even if I suffer 1,000 mutilations, what regret should I have? A man has only one death. That death may be as weighty as Mount Tai or as light as a goose feather. It all depends on the way you use it. It's really, these are brilliant voices. I hope you agree. It's no wonder that has endured for more than 2,000 years in Chinese letters. So a century after the first emperor had ordered the books burned and the historians killed, their year zero, Sima Qian reconstructed the centuries of pre-Qin history, and it's one of the great intellectual achievements of Chinese culture, the foundation of all chronological inquiries into Chinese history, and the staggering discoveries of the archaeological discoveries of the 20th century proved that even the order of the prehistoric dynasties was correct in detail. And I can't resist, terrible, isn't it, when one starts going through what shall I read? Can't resist reading you this fantastic passage about the first emperor's tomb, the famous tomb outside Xi'an, biggest tourist draw in China now, of course, Terracotta Army. This is what Sima Qian had gathered about the construction. When the first emperor ascended the throne, the digging and preparation began. Once the empire was unified, 700,000 men were sent there from all over the empire. They dug down deep to underground springs, pouring copper to place the outer casing of the coffin. Workmen were instructed to make automatic crossbows primed to shoot at intruders. Mercury was used to simulate the 100 rivers and the Yangtze and the Yellow River and the Great Sea, and set to flow mechanically. Above, the heaven was depicted, below, the geographical features of the land. And the second emperor, his son, said, "It is inappropriate for the wives of the late emperor, who have no sons, to be set free." And he ordered that they should accompany his dead father. And a great many died. And after the burial, it was suggested that it would be a serious breach if the craftsmen who'd constructed the tomb and knew of its treasures were to divulge those secrets. And therefore, after the funeral ceremonies, the inner passages and doorways were blocked and the exits sealed, trapping the workers and craftsmen inside, and no one escaped. Trees and vegetation were then planted on the tomb mound, so it resembled a natural hill. Spine-tingling, isn't it? I hope you agree. Of course, the tomb is still there. It's not yet been excavated, guarded by the Terracotta Army. Tantalizingly, the inner tomb still awaits investigation. Okay, there's my historian. My third voice is a woman's voice and an autobiography. Chinese literature from the very beginning was self-reflexive in a way that few other cultures, you say the Greeks, of course, but few other cultures were. And I've chosen something from the autobiography of the poet Li Qingzhao, who lived from 1084 to 1155. And I've loved Li Qingzhao since I was a student, when I got hold of a little book by the friend and mentor of the San Francisco Beat poets, Kenneth Rexroth, a delightful book, The Orchid Boat, which he followed by a collection of her verse. Is hers the first autobiography by a woman in world literature? I don't know. Maybe someone does. Li Qingdao lived in a fantastically sophisticated culture of the Song dynasty, perhaps the most sophisticated, advanced so far on earth. With the invention of printing, there was vast expansion of publishing, encyclopedias, science, botany, medicine, astronomy, cookbooks. There were even health and lifestyle manuals. There literally was, in 1085, published a book called How Old People Can Live Happy, Healthy Old Age, with tips on diet, exercise, and psychology. And it updated, it's still in print. Can you believe that? As a writer, Li Qingdao worked in a tradition which encouraged women to write poetry and to talk about their inner feelings, even to write history. But some men thought they should keep it to themselves and not appear in print. And that was not her view. She has a brilliant modern voice. This wonderful passage in the autobiography about her love of board games. Loved board games all my life. I lose myself in board games. I can play all night long without thought of food or sleep. All my life I've played these games and I usually win. In her autobiography, Li Qingdao interrogates her disillusion with her own first marriage, which began as a love match, but in the end she was rejected when she didn't give birth to a son. And then after she died, she bitterly describes her hasty and sadly abusive second marriage with the self-awareness of a woman of extraordinary intelligence and sensitivity. And she wrote great political poetry. Again, is she the first woman in world literature to write great political poetry? I don't know. She lived through the tragic fall of the Northern Song, betrayed, as she saw it, by the complacent government of men. So here's a little snatch of one of her poems, translated by. So I hope you see how my voices, these lives, mesh in the great events of Chinese history, and gives you an insight into the times and the feel of the times as well as lives. That brings us to emperors. My fourth voice is an emperor. Of course, great rulers have shaped Chinese history. And the figure of the sage emperor, that all-powerful, glamorous image of the sage emperor, didn't end with 1911. The same aura attached to Chairman Mao and even later leaders, one might say. The greatest emperor, perhaps, was Kangxi, the great Qing dynasty emperor who lived from 1654 to 1722, the longest ruling emperor in Chinese history, 61 years. And his personal writings, along perhaps with Babur's the Mogul's great autobiography, are among the most wonderful autobiographical tracts by a ruler in history. His laments in his disillusioned old age, so powerful. His late night reflections on rulership as he burned the midnight oil after his 61-year reign. Listen to this. Before I die, I'm letting you know my sincerest feelings. The rulers of the past all took reverence for heaven's laws and reverence for the ancestors as the fundamental way to rule the country. To be sincere in reverence for heaven and the ancestors entails the following. Be kind to men from afar. Keep the able ones near you. Nourish the people. Think of the profit of all as being the real profit, and the mind of the whole country as being the real mind. Be considerate to officials and act as a father to the people. Protect the state before danger appears, and govern well before there is any disturbance. Always be diligent, and always be careful, and maintain the balance between principle and expedience so that long-range plans can be made for the country. That's all there is to it. I don't want to be political today, but we could use some of that wisdom now, couldn't we, don't you think? Okay, so I think you've got a sense of how I'm trying to use the voices in the book, and it's full of vivid pictures of men and women who made China, from the eccentric traveler Xu Xiaoke to the novelist Zhao Sueqin, and great Chinese chronicler of the Opium War, Wei Yuan. Many of these people very little known outside the world of specialists, and laced with these new discoveries I've already mentioned, the letters from the Qin army, Silk Road letters from the Han dynasty, watchtowers in the Gobi Desert. But for my last example, we come to the revolutionary epoch of the late 19th century, which launched the great Chinese Revolution of the 20th century, which I'm tempted to say, where the dust has not yet settled. Politics are at the very heart of Chinese civilization. It sounds obvious, but sometimes I'm tempted to say that where the heart of Indian civilization and literature is spiritual, metaphysical, China's is political. Even the great archaic myths, the Yellow Emperor, King Yu, unlike, say, the Greek myths, they're political. The state is not only a historical fact, but an imaginal construct that has permeated people's lives and minds and dreams even for millennia. China is a huge country, obviously, the world's oldest continuous state. And we outsiders often imagine it's enjoyed a kind of immemorial stability, at least till the 20th century, with dynasty unrolling after dynasty rather sedately. But it's not been like that at all. In the past, it's had huge ruptures when it was by no means certain that China, a united China, would have ever have survived. It could have ended up being like Europe today, divided into many countries. As it says at the beginning of the famous novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, it is a truth universally acknowledged that the empire that falls apart will be united again. The empire that is united will fall apart. These are the cycles of Chinese history. So the state is preeminent. Better a year of tyranny than a day of anarchy, is the proverb. In 1979, when Jimmy Carter moaned to Deng Xiaoping about US politics, Deng apparently said to him, as they stood on the podium, "You should try ruling China." He later told President Bush Sr. that if we had one man vote, one vote here, the result will be chaos. We'd collapse into civil war. In China, order is everything. Since the first emperor then, the pull between harsh authoritarian rule and Confucian virtue and humanity has swayed back and forth in the balance. And attempts to alter that balance were already there in the late Ming in the 17th century. And many different trajectories for the future emerged in the 19th century, out of which, almost by historical accident, the communists triumphed, only to uncannily replicate the old patterns of authoritarian bureaucracy seen in the Ming and the Qing and earlier. But many of those trajectories are still alive and in action. And one of them was feminism, my last voice. The star writers like Chu Jin, 1875 to 1907, who was executed in the town square of her hometown, Shaoxing. "Why can't women be heroes too?" she wrote. And less famous, the mysterious He Jun, born around 1884, who wrote her feminist manifesto at the very moment the suffragettes were fighting in Britain. After a brief, fiery career during the First World War, she disappears. What happened to her? No one's sure. I've often wondered how much of China's unfolding tragedy in the 20th century she actually witnessed. But among her recently rediscovered works is an essay on the question of women's liberation, published in 1907, which now looks like one of the great tracts of feminism. Here's He Jun, 1907. For thousands of years, the world has been dominated by the rule of man. This rule is marked by class disjunctions over which men and men only exert proprietary rights. To rectify these wrongs, we must first abolish the rule of men and introduce equality among human beings, which means that the world must belong equally to men and women. The goal of equality cannot be achieved except through women's liberation. Who would guess that was a text from late Qing dynasty China? The surprises of Chinese history. So there you are. those are 5 of my voices, 6 if you include the dear old Chin soldier writing home to mum. I've just scratched the surface, but I hope I've whetted your appetite to look at Chinese history, to read my book, perhaps. In our lockdown, books are our window on the world, and in any view of the history of humanity, China, that other side of the world, the other pole of the human mind, as Simon Leys put it, has bequeathed to all of us incredible riches with which to help us reimagine the world, imagine the world with fresh eyes. And now more than ever, I think, in this COVID-afflicted world, with China in many places being demonized and mistrusted, dialogue is the most important thing. Empathy, understanding, dialogue. And it's worth us all, I think, taking a deeper look at what Confucius called this culture of ours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think I can speak for everyone when I say that was really truly fascinating and entertaining, and I couldn't help but notice your passion and enjoyment throughout your talk. I must say I've recently bought your book, but I must admit I haven't been able to get all the way through it yet. But I think following today's talk, I'm probably going to be having trouble putting it down to the detriment of my line manager. But thank you so much for your talk. For all of our attendees, now is the opportunity to ask Michael some questions. So if you hover over the bottom of the Zoom, you'll be able to see a button called Q&A. So please feel free to post any questions you might have for Michael, and I'll bring them up on screen and I'll ask him. I'll pose the questions to Michael. So please feel free to send those through. I think while we're waiting for some questions to come through, just one very quick question from me, Michael. From all your time in China, have you picked up some Mandarin?
Not very much, I'm afraid.
No.
I'm ashamed to say.
Oh, no.
Although in odd moments, dear Chinese friends have taught me 1 or 2 of the poems.
Mm-hmm.
So I have been known when I've had the odd drink to give you dear old Du Mu's Yangzhou Meng poem, or a few things like that. But no, I need to work on my Mandarin.
Okay. That sounds amazing. Drunken recitements of Chinese poetry. We've had one question come through. So what is your view on the international relationship between China and the world? How has it been changing over years?
Wow, that's a very big question. And it depends how far back you want to look at it, because of course, China's relationship with the world goes back a very long way. The Tang Dynasty, of which I was speaking, everybody said in the Chinese public in the Shanghai Expo were all saying that was when China went out to the world and went out to Japan as well as to the Western world. So the biggest thing I would say is that China is often portrayed as a civilization which is introverted and inward looking and builds great walls. But actually, the greatest periods of Chinese culture have always been periods of internationalism and adopting things from other cultures, massive adoptions, which you can't imagine in the Western world, like Buddhism from India, for example. So there's that. In terms of today, that's another question entirely. So I'm not quite sure where to direct the answer to that question. Obviously, China's collision with the West, which began seriously in the early 19th century with the Opium Wars, and then foreign powers creating their enclaves on the shores of China. That contributed to massive debate inside China, where people no longer believed that the old civilization could sustain itself without radical change. And should that change draw on China's own past predominantly? Should it use Western technology, or should it use Western technology and Western ideas? So the question of how we transform China to respond to the outside world in the 19th century and the 20th century became one of the great issues of Chinese civilization. And it kind of came back in Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up in 78, 79, 80, and what followed. Because, of course, Deng's solution to China's backwardness after 30 years of communism was to use Western ideas, technology, Western technology, Western ideas of the market, and so on. So there's always been this seesawing between the integrity of Chinese civilization and the impact of the outside world right through Chinese history. But it's such a big question. We could talk all night about that, really.
Yeah, we could. I see we've got lots of other questions
I don't want to
coming in.
And I don't want to be too controversial now about China's current relationship with the outside world.
Yeah, so maybe we should move swiftly on then. I'll take these in chronological order. So the next one up, how do you find sharing your appreciation of Chinese literature with other non-Chinese speaking people?
Well, I mean, one of the great things about Nicolas Chapuis's book, actually, and there's a wonderful interview with him in English online, actually, which I do recommend to everybody, is his belief that Chinese literature doesn't have to be inaccessible to people who don't read Chinese. That the greatest Chinese literature is universal. It's about humanity, and you can get huge enjoyment and understanding out of it. And these great translations coming out recently just show you that. So I think sharing that is an interesting thing. I'm a filmmaker, and the Story of China films had quite a few scenes in about Chinese literature. And then I've just made a film about China, about Du Fu, in which inevitably in the BBC version, Sir Ian McKellen read those poems in English. And so you're a step away from the complexity of Du Fu's writing in his own language. But the response was great, because it opens doors for people to worlds they didn't know existed. And I think that's the response we got from the audience here. It can start you on a path, can't it? For some people, it can take you to learning the language and appreciating the poetry in its own language. But for others, you're looking at it in translation. But you can go a long way with great translations.
Yeah, definitely. Next question. Hi, Michael. Where do you think China's headed in the next 10 to 20 years?
Whoa.
Another big one.
Well, it's funny. When we were about to just starting in the middle of doing Story of China films in 2015, I spoke to a very eminent Western scholar. And I said, where do you think it's heading? And he said, I'll tell you what I think. The signs are not great at the moment. And in the short term, I'm not very optimistic. And I don't think the Chinese are going to be very good neighbors, he said. But medium to long term, I'm very optimistic. And I think we all have to work together, because climate change is the biggest challenge in history. And I think the Chinese are seriously on board about that. And we need the Chinese to be on board about that for things to be turned around. And I think President Xi is absolutely serious about his idea of an ecological civilization. They have to, because of course their own environment was devastated during not only the 30 years of Maoism, but the reform and opening up with unfettered growth also caused devastation. But it had begun under the Republic, to be honest, that kind of environmental damage. So I think that's something that we can be optimistic about. In terms of the politics of China, I think many people would say, well, under Deng Xiaoping, one of the things Deng Xiaoping said in his famous speech in 1978 winter was that China had to have a workable legal system. And Deng Xiaoping did lay the foundations for that. And there were many achievements in employment rights, women's rights, and so on. But the opinion of those who know is that stalled in around 2010. And there's this essential issue about the rule of law and how you can achieve that in a one-party state. But the general feeling is that the next, President Xi and his contemporaries are all the sons of some of the great people of the 50s and 60s. President Xi's father, Xi Zhongxun, was led the reform and opening up down in Guangzhou, and was an associate of Mao. So they're of that generation. The feeling is the generation who've grown up in the reform and opening up will have a different attitude to the world. So I think that idea that short term it may be difficult, but medium to long term, there are causes for optimism. Mm-hmm. I'm simply telling you what I'm told. I'm not an expert on the court politics of today's China, but I like that.
Yeah, no, sounds good and optimistic to me.
Yeah.
Next up, which part of Chinese history would you consider to be the most interesting and why?
Wow. Well, so many areas of Chinese history are so fantastic that you can be totally immersed in them. I mean, the 18th century is culturally is just so fantastic. The Tang Dynasty, of course, is an amazing period. But the Song Dynasty is the period that I particularly find really, really interesting. They come to power in the 960s after the 5 dynasties interregnum of chaos and breakdown, when China might never have united, and they unite China, not including the whole of the north, but they unite most of China. But the cultural achievements then and scientific achievements, and the printing became a major thing in Chinese culture. And so, as I mentioned in the talk, so many things became available to people. You could even get your cramming manuals for sitting the imperial examinations, let alone the kind of foodie guides to the restaurants of Kaifeng. So to me, the song is just brilliant. I think if I had the chance as a historian to time travel, I would love to set out from Britain in Anglo-Saxon England around the year 1000, and take in Europe and Fatimids in Cairo and Itchol in India, and get to Song China and sit down in one of the great restaurants in Kaifeng and look at where the world was then. It's an amazing period, and China, I think most people would agree, was the most advanced society that had yet existed on Earth. And one of the great conundrums, which I talk about in the book, is when you're almost in the early modern. Then Europe's in the medieval, in China you're in the early modern, and you've made all the great inventions, and your printing and steel technology, you name it. Why did it not become the first, what we would call modern state? And of course, there's all sorts of interesting questions about that. But the Song Dynasty, long answer, sorry.
You've actually answered one of the other questions with the mention of, if you could time travel, could someone asked if you could visit one period or event in Chinese history, which would it be? So I think you've covered off that question as well.
Yeah, Kaifeng. I've always loved Kaifeng. I first went to Kaifeng in the early 80s, and it's such a great place. My terror is that, having gone back to it again, first in 2014 and 15, and you see the developers, which happens all over China, doesn't it? The new old, that you see these wonderful hutongs with these crumbling old houses with Qing dynasty fronts to them and everything, and they're all earmarked for demolition and rebuilding as a sort of fictional old, and I remember doing a little speech on Henan local television saying, no, please don't knock them all down. I mean, Kaifeng is a fantastic place, a fantastically interesting place. The China's last Jewish community, a big, dating from the Song Dynasty, Christian churches, very interesting Muslim 20 mosques with women's mosques with women prayer leaders in Kaifeng. You know, it's culturally got so many interesting things, and cultural and physical survivals, you know. And of course, it's wonderfully recorded in the song, where you've got memoirs, books about the restaurants, books about the society, and the famous Qingming Festival scroll, which is perhaps the most famous work of art in China. Is it shows Kaifeng in a spring day in about 11:20, and you're walking in from the countryside through the gates, and it names the restaurants and the taverns and the lawyers and the wine shops, and they're real, you know. Kaifeng is mesmerizingly fabulous.
That sounds fascinating. Next up, what do you think is the state of literature and poetry in China today?
Well, I'm not an expert on this, and but mine at all, of course. So I'm not the person to ask. But it is Chinese culture is very dynamic. Chinese film culture is very dynamic. So many great movie makers. There's the youth culture in Beijing, you know, with the music, the bands, you know, there's a huge amount of literature being published. You've got major novelists, you know, science fiction novelists. From what I can gather, there's a very dynamic series of subcultures in China, and mainstream novelists who are really great. I think Netflix is about to do a drama series of one of the big science fiction series that's been written by a modern Chinese writer.
Apologies. The dog's just come in, so if she starts barking, I might need to go on mute. Next question. Has analysing Chinese culture changed your perception of the Western culture? Has it made you reevaluate any elements of the Western culture?
Well, I think, you know, my academic background as a historian is actually in the 9th, 10th century in the West. So that's what I write academic stuff about. Song dynasty over the other side of the world, if you like. But all I would say is that I think that in any enterprise like this, and I'm sure we all feel the same, the crucial thing, if you want to understand anything about anybody, is to put yourself in their shoes, isn't it? How do they see it? How do they feel? Why do they feel like that? Why do I feel this way about them? Do I really understand what they're doing? And I think with somewhere like China, obviously you really need to speak the language and read the script, but second best is to spend a long time in the country and be with people who are really good guides who initiate you into lots of things. And so of course it does. Yeah, it not only changes your perception of everything, but it changes your perception of the relative weight of histories as well. And when you encounter Chinese history in a broad sense, there's so much of it, and it's so rich and contains everything. I mean, look, you know, a feminist manifesto from 1907. I mean, a great woman's autobiography from, you know, the 1130s. It's whole other universes. And that inevitably is a great experience for any human to have, isn't it? You know, and I'm sure everybody listening to this will agree. It's a wonderful privilege to be welcomed into a foreign culture and to be shown things about it and to allow you to understand things about it. The first filming day that we did on the story of China, we went on a little recce. I had a long contact with a guy who teaches at Hong Kong Chinese University, who'd written a book in English about his family traditions, using the old family gazetteers. He'd written it at the end of the 80s, and they're called the family called the Qin family. They're from Wuxi, and we went to see them, and we asked whether we could film at the Qingming Festival when they once again worship at the Tomb of the Ancestors, which of course was a ritual banned in the 60s. And it was incredibly moving. 300 or 400 people came from all over China, and 1 or 2 from Malaysia and other places. And we had a riotous weekend at the Grand Canal Hotel in the middle of Wuxi, where distinguished old uncles got kind of paralytic, and everybody had wonderful meals, and it was incredibly convivial. If you wanted to understand anything about Chinese culture, that combination of the love of the first ancestor whose tomb it was a poet, Qingguan, and the love of the history, the love of family, the incredible sociability, and the sheer exuberance of it all, and the serious intent behind it, and the kind of spiritual intent behind it even. And that was our first experience, really. And you come away from that feeling kind of elated, as if somebody's opened a door to something that you never really understood before.
I'm really sad to say that it looks like we've run out of time. I've been really enjoying those answers, Michael. So I think that, unfortunately, is the end of the Q&A. Thank you very much for everyone's questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get through them all. I think it looks like there's still about 14 to go, but unfortunately, that'll have to do for today.